Hello, I'm Suzette Field of A Curious Invitation. Welcome to the 32 Londoners podcast series. Along with Stephen Coates of Antique Beat, on May the 1st, I curated an extraordinary event on the EDF Energy London Eye. For one rotation, each of the Eye's 32 capsules was occupied by a speaker giving a talk about one of 32 significant born Londoners to a small audience. Here is Philippa Thomas on writer Zadie Smith.
Perfect.
Thank you. You're already a lovely audience. I'm not talking about Zadie Smith because I'm from the BBC. I read and read and read. I wrote something about Zadie Smith. In fact, I tweeted about her a few years ago. Somebody got in touch and said, would you like to expand on the tweet? So that expanded into a chapter, into a review, into a book. And so I'm talking to you as an enthusiastic amateur about Zadie Smith. Let me check first. How much has everybody read a Zadie Smith novel? Yes. Yeah. Pretty much all. What about White Teeth? Can I have some hands? Yes. There are no right or wrong answers. I just want to know where I am. Northwest, the NW, the latest one, or have an idea of that. That's good. So we know pretty much where we are. Okay, if my iPad works, we'll start. And I won't feel bad if you're not looking at me. So, you know, if you want to kind of look, take photos, do. But I want to begin by talking about Zadie Smith, by not beginning at the beginning. I want to look back just 2 years ago, the summer of the London Olympics, August 2012. It was a brilliant summer. It didn't rain very much. You know, the athletes shone, the sun shone most of the time, the trains kept running, the tubes were open. And the London Eye featured as part of the opening and closing ceremonies. You know, it was people felt good about themselves in London. And in the run-up to the Olympics, the corner of London that Zadie Smith immortalised in White Teeth featured as well. It played its part. Now, according to the Brent and Kilburn Times, on the 25th of July 2012, thousands of residents spilled onto the streets to celebrate and welcome the Olympic torch relay. A chosen few ran with the torch, and they were nominated for their tireless community work. And a month later, her fourth novel, NW, Northwest, was published. And here's a taste of how she opens. In the estate, a grim girl on the third floor screams Anglo-Saxon at nobody. It ain't like that. Nah, it ain't like that. Don't you start. Fag in hand, fleshy, lobster red. This story is a disillusioned story about Londoners trapped in poverty and their own mindset. She talks about Kilburn being ungentrified, ungentrifiable. She talks about boom and bust. Never come here. Bust is permanent in Kilburn. I now need to ask if you to put hands up if you live in Kilburn or Willesden or not. Okay, that's good. Okay. What Zadie Smith writes does make me think about the different Londons that coexist and that rub against each other. I've been a Londoner since my 20s, so I've loved it for a couple of decades now, but it really strikes me, you know, when you look out tonight, it's still raining, but bright lights, big city, big tourist sites. I think the Shard is behind over there somewhere. You know, the symbols of a skyline that's still growing, a city that's booming. And I don't know whether you see this as, you know, a proud statement of a city that's getting ahead, that's thrusting forwards, or whether you think it's a city that's stinking of the money of the hyper-privileged few, because this is also a city between the lights that we can all see, where hundreds of families are being pushed out by the bedroom tax, where there are welfare cuts, where there are unaffordable homes, where there's a push and shove for the best places or any places in primary schools. There's a darkness in between the bright lights, and whether you think the bright lights make the darkness worth it would be a political lecture. I'm not giving you a political lecture, so talk about that later if you want. So Zadie Smith, though, I think gets the different Londons, and she's very good about talking about real London in a way that makes characters spring off the pages of her novels. And she can be very, very funny. It's bleak, but it's funny. So I know most of you have read some Zadie Smith, but we'll just remind you about the 4 novels and the novelist, and I'll see where we are. Okay. Zadie Smith is how she began. She's the daughter of a white English father and a Jamaican mother. She went to Hampstead Comprehensive, which was founded as a secondary modern, was pretty much seen, I think, in those days as an education factory. Today it's described by Ofsted, the school's inspectorate, as following a relentless drive for improvement, and that's pretty much what Zadie did. Zadie became Zadie when she was 14. She went to Cambridge University. She pulled free, and she's looked back at that and written about it. She says she wrote about her relationship with her dad in the New Yorker a few years ago and said, class-wise, each year placed us further apart. As in many British families, it was university what done it. She got out, she could feel herself moving, and there's a lot of that in the novels. So just to remind you, her first novel, White Teeth, northwest London. Which direction is it? Looking over there, I think. But that brought her corner of London to life, her multicultural corner of London. And she starts with two somewhat hapless men. There's a Bangladeshi immigrant, Samad Iqbal, and the Englishman, Archie Jones. And in that novel, she hit so many different notes about London: property, schools, class, race, and all the tensions and turbulence of living in London. It became an instant classic. That was 2000, so 2 years later, her second novel is Autograph Man, which is very different and quite introverted by comparison, I think. I'm not an expert, but I'm telling you what I think. It's about a lost boy, 12-year-old Alex Lee Tandem, who has a Jewish mum and a Chinese dad. He loses that father suddenly when he's 12 and throws himself into a lifelong obsession with hunting for autographs, for film stars' autographs, celebrities. It is much more inward-looking, but you do get the same kind of funny and bleak look at London as well. So I'll give you a few quotes from that. 3 years after that, On Beauty is the American campus novel, a classic of its kind. It's a thinly disguised Harvard, which I recognise from having been there a few years ago. And Zadie Smith herself, as a 30-year-old famous young novelist, had been invited, had gone to Harvard. Again, we're looking through the eyes of a hapless, stumbling man, art history lecturer Howard Belsey, who got away from his working class roots here in London. And we see our city through him and through his mixed-race children coming back. And then finally, the most recent book, NW, Northwest, 2012, time of the Olympics, starts with the kids who went to what she calls the 1,000-kid madhouse of the local state school. They tried to get up, they tried to get out, but as you know from the book, this is not a sunny story. They fail. It's got all the colour of the first novel, White Teeth, all that noise and energy, but I find it more nasty, more bleak, more claustrophobic. It seems to say that this view, you know, these kind of horizons, uplifting as they are only for the few of us. So, as we're on our way up over London, the first thing I want to take as a theme is Zadie Smith's sense of space. You know, she's bringing London alive. And I'm going to start with something positive, because I loved her description of Hampstead Heath in On Beauty, when Howard Belsey is bringing back his American family. So, this is the way she puts it. It's a sprawling North London parkland composed of oaks, willows and chestnuts, yews and sycamores, the beech and the birch, that encompasses the city's highest point and spreads far beyond it. Now, where's Hampstead Heath? I should know this, I should have worked this out. Now, do you know whereabouts Hampstead would be? North London is... It's night time, we can imagine it. Green, sprawling, lovely over there. She talks about tickling bushgrass to hide teenage lovers and joint smokers, broad oaks for brave men to kiss against, mown meadows for summer ball games, hills for kites, ponds for hippies, an icy pond for old men with strong constitutions, mean llamas for mean children, and for the tourists, a country house. Hampstead Heath, glory of London, where Keats walked and Jarman fucked, where Orwell exercised his weakened lungs, and Constable never failed to find something holy. It really sings that passage, but straight after that, you get the classic Zadie Smith transition, the way she talks about the way that this city, our city, changes and moves up and down the register of class and affluence just with every few streets, road by road. So this is about the Belseys visiting London, and straight after that, they head on to a funeral. They get in a minicab. Through the grubby windows of their minicab, the Belseys watched Hampstead morph into West Hampstead into Willesden. At every railway bridge, a little more graffiti, on every street, fewer trees, in their branches, more fluttering plastic bags. An acceleration of establishments selling fried chicken, until in Willesden Green it seemed every other shop sign made reference to poultry. And this I get because there's a fried chicken shop at the end of my street. And my street is one of those London streets that's either slightly rotten, or ripe for improvement, going up, just don't know which, on the edge. And there's a lot of that in Zadie Smith. And for me, one of the great achievements of her novels is that she injects black comedy into, you know, homes and property. There's the pull-out in the Evening Standard, isn't there? It's a London obsession. But she gets the gradations of neighbourhoods and she gives it to us very cleverly. We're up here getting a glorious overview, even with the rain. And she's down there giving us granular social realism. I'm going to give you one more example of the way she does that, from White Teeth, the first novel. Her heroine, Clara, is moving from Cricklewood to the house in posher Willesden Green that her husband has picked out. And this is how she describes the move. Travelling in the front passenger seat of the removal van, she'd seen the high road and it had been ugly and poor and familiar. But then at the turn of a corner, suddenly roads had exploded in greenery, beautiful oaks. The houses got taller, wider, more detached. She could see parks, she could see libraries. And then abruptly the trees would be gone, reverting back into bus stops as if by the strike of some midnight bell, a signal which the houses too obeyed, transforming themselves into smaller, stairless dwellings that sat splay opposite derelict shopping arcades. She's very poetic sometimes. And I think Zadie Smith really captures what social mobility means to urbanites, not just London, urbanites, but especially here. You can move up in the world by moving down a street or two. And in White Teeth, she writes about the Bangladeshi couple, Samad and Alsana Iqbal. It had taken a year of mercilessly hard graft to make the momentous move from the wrong side of Whitechapel to the wrong side of Willesden. That's classic Zadie Smith. Sometimes you get out altogether. In Northwest, some of her characters look out longingly, and the Khan kid in the newsagent says, "I'm in Hendon now, innit?" speaking a little bashfully, as if it was too much good luck to confess to. But the suburbs, outside these horizons, are not the answer in a Zadie Smith novel. In Autograph Man, her second book, she's scathing about them. She gives us the imaginary Mountjoy, which is home to squat suburban palaces and pruned trees. And this is the way she describes it. The people of Mountjoy have based their lives on the principle of compromise. Each night they quietly embrace the earplugs and migraines and stress-related muscular discomfort they receive in exchange for cheap houses sitting directly in the flight path of an international airport. This is not the promised land. This is an affordable, 50s-built, central heating, locking as standard, schools included, commuter village on the northernmost tip of the city of London. To live in London for her is to struggle. Everyone in Mountjoy had a headache, plain noise, pollution, stress, the unholy trinity of Mountjoy life. So as her books go through, she's not as optimistic as the view we're getting, really. The question they throw up for me is, does the struggle of everyday life in London get you anywhere? And I see a real difference between the first novel, White Teeth. Her first novel, She's Younger, change is possible. She's an optimist. And Northwest is 12 years later. And there the protagonists are thrown back. It seems to me they're burned for trying to get out, for trying to make something of themselves. And in the last novel, Northwest, the book's success story seems to be Keisha Blake, who changes her name. As Sadie became Zadie, she becomes Natalie De Angelis. She goes to university. She becomes a barrister. Perfect husband, 2 perfect kids, large London house. She sums it up: private wards, Christmas abroad, security systems, fences, the carriage of a 4x4 that lets you sit alone above traffic. But she is alone, and she crashes and burns. She even thinks about suicide on that high bridge above Archway. I don't know if you know it, it's the A1 going north out of London, very high bridge. And she ends up there after staggering over Hampstead Heath, which is where we heard such lyricism from Zadie Smith in Another Spot. Not everything I say is going to be doom and gloom, but everything she writes is thought-provoking and full of life, because it's not just about the spaces, it's not just about the property. Zadie Smith also throws into her mashup of London life so much about people. You know, she's talked about the melting pot in her novels, and there's London as a great multicultural city. Even in the suburbs in Autograph Man, the furthest out of the novels, Alex Lee, the protagonist, is half Chinese. His friend Adam is an immigrant Harlem Jew, black as Pete, he describes himself. It's a whole cast of characters pulled together by what it means to be Jewish in North London. In Willesden in Northwest, I love the passages where she writes about everybody coming together, the quiet old Anglican church, which now gathers a congregation of Polish, Indian, African, Caribbean, She describes women getting themselves together for a night out, a warm night out along the Edgware Road. And they are from St. Kitts, Trinidad, Barbados, Grenada, Jamaica, India, Pakistan. And out by the bus stop, there's the sweet stink of the hookah couscous kebab. And the most positive vision I find is in that first book, From White Teeth, where she talks about the melting pot in very sunny terms. She puts it this way: this has been the century of strangers, brown, white and yellow. This has been the century of the great immigrant experiment. It's only this late in the day, and possibly only in Willesden, that you can find best friends Sita and Sharon, constantly mistaken for each other because Sita is white. Her mother liked the name. Sharon is Pakistani. Her mother thought it best, less trouble. We've finally slipped into each other's lives, she says, with reasonable comfort. And then, after White Teeth, this is my reading, but I think the more you read, the more edged there gets, and the more that optimism gets diluted. Even in White Teeth, there's an awful lot of black comedy in it, funny scenes, but sad as well. There's one that really strikes me where it's Harvest Festival, you know, and the kids are being sent out to their designated pensioners to take food packages. So Erie, Milat, Magid visit their pensioner, and she says, Mr. J.P. Hamilton, confronted on his doorstep by 3 dark-skinned children clutching a myriad of projectiles, was duly surprised. And just there's always a bit of edge there. In On Beauty, where she's looking back from America to London, I think she starts even criticising herself because she's a success. You know, her first novel was such a success. She started to be able to move away. So I really don't mind if you need to take photos. We're getting to the really beautiful bit at the top, but I'm just going to read this to you, which is Howard Belsey, the working class Londoner who moved away. He lives in New England. He's on campus, comfortable life. He comes home again. Now listen for the twist in this. To appreciate Cricklewood, you have to walk its streets, as Howard did that afternoon. Then you find out that there's more charm in a half mile of Cricklewood's passing human faces than in all the double-fronted Georgian houses in Primrose Hill. The African women in the colourful Kenty clothes, the whippet blonde with 3 phones tucked into the waistband of her tracksuit, the unmistakable Poles and Russians introducing the bone structure of Soviet realism to an island of chinless, browless potato faces. The Irishmen resting on the gates of housing estates like farmers at a pig fair in Kerry. At this distance, walking past them all, not having to talk to any of them, Howard was able to love them, and more than this, to feel himself, in his own romantic fashion, to be one of them. We scum, we happy scum. To people like these, he would always belong. It was an ancestry he referred to proudly at Marxist conferences and in print. It was a communion he occasionally felt on the streets of New York and in the urban outskirts of Paris. For the most part, however, Howard liked to keep his working class roots where they flourished best, in his imagination. And in that third novel, I do wonder, and I don't know, how much Zadie Smith is consciously sending herself up. She's the best-selling, prize-winning, transatlantic author who'll move not only to leafier Queen's Park in northwest London, but away to New York City. She knows she can afford to move away from the place that is providing her material. And then when you get to that 4th novel, Northwest, or you read some of her later essays, it's harsher still. And if you've read Northwest, you'll know there's very little sense left of a kind of melting together, of a kind of happy fusion of Londoners, let alone of Londoners being in it together. And so that brings me to another kind of constant pressure behind the narrative of the novels. You know, earlier I referred to the Shard, you know, all the skyscrapers that are going up. London is changing so fast, and there's a constant debate about how windy it is up here, about whether, you know, it's just for the super rich, whether it's for wealth from abroad, how much is London for Londoners as it's all changing. There's a huge amount of development down there at Battersea, you know, where the American embassy is going to be. There are going to be all these new amazing apartments, and the talk is a lot of them are being bought off plan from abroad. Who is London for? And that's very Zadie Smith. One of the things she talks about is, what life chances do Londoners have, and you know, is it getting worse? And she's written essays. I just want to quote some of the essays she's written about her own family experiences. In The New Yorker in 2008, she tells us about her father, Harvey. She says, he grew up in a pokey housing estate in Willesden Green, and he committed a late failed marriage to a Jamaican girl less than half his age. In the New York Review of Books a couple of years ago, she wrote a long essay talking about Willesden public libraries being threatened by government spending cuts. And I know this is a campaign she's been involved in, and one of the libraries got a reprieve a couple of months ago, so she's been very involved in that. She reminisces about a state which gave her everything, from her NHS specs at the age of 9 when she was Zadie, to her NHS baby at the age of 33, and she concludes the state is not what it was. And you see that thread running through all the novels. There are quite a few sly digs and political statements there about schools, for example, you know, in any city, but particularly in London. That's a very live issue. White Teeth, the very first book, if you've read that, it opens with this awful, hilarious scene. Failed suicide, Archie Jones clings on crazily to the apron of the local butcher who has inadvertently saved him by moving on his car, get out of the way please, which was filling up with poisonous fumes. And you ask, why is Archie a failure? And we find out later that the slide started at the age of 11, the British education system having tripped him up with a snigger. And there's another reference in the book to Archie's failure to go to grammar school because his mum couldn't afford the uniform. And then, you know, is the comprehensive system better? Well, 12 years later in Northwest, we read about Leah, one of the protagonists, as a state school wild card who got to university. But then she doesn't have the confidence to really remake herself. And that's all relevant to today's debates about academies and free schools and about reinventing public education, and does everybody have a stab at an equal chance? Also in Northwest, Leah's partner, Michael, is a French-Algerian boy with an ambition that would make Margaret Thatcher proud. He wants to move on from the council flat into a proper flat, a mortgage. He has a dream. He says, if we ever have a little boy, I want him to live somewhere, to live proud, somewhere we have the freehold. Well, how many 20-something couples buy freehold in London now? You know, this is a minority sport if you're very, very lucky. Now, maybe her next book will be sunnier. And it's worth noting that in the US, where I lived for 8 years out of the last 14, the state gives you a lot less. I mean, in terms of health, in terms of education. But one of my overwhelming impressions of Zadie Smith's novels is that through them she's illustrating the slow slide of Britain's enabling state. I am a bit gloomy here. My last theme, and then I'll welcome questions or thoughts, is about the sense of London as a place of freedom, of optimism, or of menace and even danger. No, she doesn't reflect terrorist attacks. She doesn't really talk about security, but I think it's really notable that the breakout novel, White Teeth, was published the year before 9/11. And in it, there's a fundamentalist group, Kevin, keepers of the eternal and victorious Islamic nation, Kevin. We watch them gather strength. They're activists, rant at meetings in Kilburn Town Hall, but they are amateurs, and it's written almost as a comedy sideshow. There's very, very funny kind of final scenes where they're involved. And the later the book, the more the sense of freewheeling anarchy that you get in White Teeth that makes it a very funny book, the more that turns somewhat sour and to menace. And I've got one contrast to bring out here, which is about travelling on the trains, travelling public transport in London. In Autograph Man in 2002, Zadie Smith writes about the Overground, which I take all the time. I don't know if you know the one I mean. They've just made it into a circle around London. She says everybody in the north of London knows this line affectionately as the free train. There are no machines and no one ever pays. That would be nice. Kids smoke on it. Tramps live on it. The clouds of marijuana smoke make your eyes sore. I was thinking, really? But there you go. To look out of the windows at the passing world is to think that the city consists only of forests and schools and sporting arenas and swimming pools. The dark satanic mills must be somewhere else. This whole place looks like the promised land, what you see from the free train. But by Northwest, the train journey that really strikes you is the one we take with young Felix, who's the black Londoner who's trying really hard to get on and escape his world of sitting on concrete steps in a stairwell on Coldwell Estate. There is a scene I covered the Stephen Lawrence murder trial, you know, and you think about stabbings and you think about casual violence and racism, and there are kind of echoes. It's referred to in that book obliquely. The scene with Felix, he's on the underground. He exchanges words, innocent words really, with a group of young black youths sitting opposite. And it ends in a stabbing, a casual knifing. He just left his sudden death. So the more you read the books, I've just reread them all, the novels, there's that volatility between optimism and energy and richness and openness and despair and futility and alienation. And that's the whole of life's rich pattern, I guess. And I wonder whether, I hope I haven't put you off reading them if you haven't, but do you come away from reading Zadie Smith feeling the alienation of some of her characters, or being energized by the picture, you know, the rich pattern of London life? And we're going down, aren't we? I have two final quotations to offer you from Zadie Smith's first novel, White Teeth, which, if you haven't read any Zadie Smith, is the one you really ought to. Londoner Samal Iqbal, as British now as he is Bengali, ends the novel in despair about the way that his twin boys have turned out and the way they've been treated and their life chances. And he lashes out at London. He says, who would want to stay? Cold, wet, miserable, terrible food, dreadful newspapers. Who would want to stay in a place where you're never welcomed, only tolerated, like you're an animal, finally house-trained? Who would want to stay? But in that scene, the teenager listening to him is Irie Jones. She's a Willesden girl. She's a quarter Jamaican. Thus Samad described this dystopia with a look of horror. Irie was ashamed to find that the land of accidents sounded like paradise to her. It sounded like freedom. And she, Irie, would want to be here. She would grasp this opportunity and she would want to see these horizons. So I'm leaving you with no definitive thoughts about Zadie Smith because she throws up both sides. And though I think it gets bleaker through her novels, there's always some comedy, some light, some energy, some sense of another generation starting again. And I would be really interested to know the next Zadie Smith novel, whenever it comes out, whether she would have something to say about, you know, the London of new skyscrapers and the boom and the money flooding in, and the 20-somethings who can't get jobs even though they've got 2 degrees, you know, or can't get houses or are still living with their parents, and that kind of sense of it's more unequal, if more glittering than ever before.
Thanks for listening. 32 Londoners was sponsored by Hendrick's Gin, who created 32 unique cocktails, one for each capsule and one for each London borough. To hear more talks and for more information on 32 Londoners, go to 32londoners.com. Or, for more information on Antique Beat and A Curious Invitation and the other events we create, go to www.antiquebeat.co.uk or acuriousinvitation.com.